If it's 0 degrees out today and it's supposed to be twice as cold tomorrow, what's the temperature supposed to be? Hello, I'm Robert. Thank you so much for joining me here in my home studio today. That track that you just heard, all of it was recorded with none other than my beloved Crate BV120H Blue Voodoo head. The Blue Voodoo was my very first tube amp, and I have always loved the Blue Voodoo. The Blue Voodoo, was, of course, came out in the 90s, and I think production on those ran all the way into the early 2000s, I believe, though the later years I think they had moved production over to China. However, most of them were made in the U.S., including this one. The generation before it was actually the first one that I had, which was, for all intents and purposes, the same amp, except for where the BV120H block logo is on the front of this amp. The first generation of those actually had what I call the cartoon logo on the front of them, and that's the one that I had. I don't know what, if anything, was different internally from that version, from that generation to this one, but I always thought that the block loader sounded a little bit better. At least they sounded better than my first one. I loved my first one, but admittedly, there always seemed to be something off about it. And when I finally went to sell it, and the only reason I sold it was because, at the time I could only afford to keep one amp at a time. And honestly, I was sick of it and I wanted something new. So when I went to sell it, the guy that I was selling it to wanted me to put some new tubes in it. And I discovered then, after having it for all of those years, because I'd never retubed it, that it had a hodgepodge of preamp tubes in there from the previous owner. So that could have very well been why that one sounded different from all of these that I've heard. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, this was considered to be a high-gain monster. I always thought of these as kind of the poor man's JCM 900. So, if you take a little bit closer look at this thing, it's got a lot of the same features as the Marshall JCM 900, the dual reverbs anyway. Of course, 2-channel amplifier, independent reverb on each channel. Let's see, 4 6L6 power tubes, 4 12AX7 preamp tubes, effects loop, a couple of speaker outputs, 816 ohm resistance selections, etc., etc. Pretty common stuff that you saw in amps back in those days and still see today. What is different about this amp from the dual reverbs is each channel actually has its own independent EQ, independent 3-band EQ, whereas the 900s actually have a shared EQ. So a little bit more tonal flexibility there from that respect. No gain on the clean channel. So the clean channel is just clean. You can crank that up all the way up, get a little bit of breakup out of the tubes, but not much. For the most part, the thing just stays pretty clean, just gets louder. Of course, a global presence control, the ability to turn the effects loop on and off, as well as a minus 20 dB pad on the effects loop. So lots of cool features. And most importantly, I think it sounds great. I always thought this amp sounds great. Let's go up close and do a little twisty knobby stuff here and hear the range of everything and kind of get an idea how it sounds. Now, when I owned the first one, I also had the matching cab, and they made 2 different cabs for it. They had a vintage 30 cab, and they had the regular Blue Voodoo cab that had the eminent speakers in it, and that's actually the one that I had. A Marshall 1960 is actually pretty close to that cab, so that's what I am going to actually run this into and mic it up with both an SM57 as well as a Sennheiser E906, and that's it. No EQs or compressors or anything like that. What you hear is what you get. Yeah, I've said it already a few times, but I'm going to say it again. I've always loved the Blue Voodoos. You know, they will always have a real soft spot in my heart. The 60 watt and the 120 watt heads are pretty. You can find them out on the used market still pretty easily. This is obviously the 120. I found this amp for $235, and it's in great shape. You know, there's some, you know, the Tolex is faded. You know, it's got some, you know, some dirt and dust and stuff that's down in it that may clean out, it may not. But for the most part, you know, I mean, there's no rips or tears or anything like that in it. One of the LEDs behind one of the power tubes seems to be out, but the power tube itself seems to be working. You know, this thing's got a few miles on it, but overall it's in pretty good shape. I would love to be able to track down a 150 or a 300 watt, and somebody actually did point me in the direction of a 300 watt about 4, 5, 6 months or so ago when I was talking about these amps on my channel, and unfortunately I didn't, you know, at the time I wasn't in a position that I could pull the trigger on it. So but I have always wanted a replacement for my old 120 watt head because I've always regretted getting rid of it. So now I have it back. And I will say that when I first plugged this thing in, it sounded for the most part just like I remembered it. It sounded great, but I had forgotten how ungodly loud these amps are. If you pick one up and you want something that's not quite so loud, go find a 60 watt head, because the 120s, the 60s are loud too, but the 120s are like just ungodly loud. The 150s and the 300s will rip your head off. So don't ask me what I'm ever going to do with one of those, because I don't even know of an attenuator that's made that could tame those things down. But that's, you know, if I run across one for the right price, it's still not going to stop me from buying one. You know, I will say, when I owned the first one 15 years ago, I thought I had died and gone to heaven tone-wise, because, like I said, number one, it was my first tube amp, and number two, it was heavy sounding. It had what I thought was a ton of gain at the time, and it still has a lot of gain. I still think that, but it's here now 15 years later, it's not as modern sounding as some of the other, a lot of the other amps that are out on the market that we're used to hearing today. It doesn't sound like one of those. It doesn't sound like a dual rack or Engel or something like that. But it does have have a lot of gain in it, plenty of gain for, certainly plenty for me, as well as some great clean sounds, an excellent effects loop circuit. It takes pedals really, really well. It's one thing I've always liked about them. All the effects that you heard in that track at the beginning of the video, by the way, were all pedals going into the amp. There was no plug-in effects or anything like that. So yeah, Blue Voodoos are awesome, and I think everybody should agree with me, even if you don't. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. Links to all of the gear used in this video will be down in the description. Please leave a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. If you had never heard of Blue Voodoo and this is the first time that you had ever actually heard it, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.